In the last video I posted, I showed the process of building my first workbench in my garage. This was always intended to be used as an outfeed table for my table saw. So in this video, I'll take you through the process of how I built a table saw stand that matched the height of the first workbench and how I extended the miter channels of the table saw into it. The first step was to measure out the dimensions of the table saw itself. This then gave me the height of 33 centimeters from the worktop, which I could use that measurement to rough sketch what I thought this would look like from the front. If this diagram here doesn't make a lot of sense, here's a quick clip that should hopefully show what this looks like from the front when built. So this rough sketch is what I referred to when I built the stand, but I appreciate it's very confusing to follow, so I'll start with a new one. As I mentioned, I knew the table saw was 33 centimeters high, and that once it was sat on its stand, it needed to be 96 centimeters tall in total to match the height of the other workbench. I therefore came up with a simple box that featured a shelf in the middle where I could store my table saw sleds, and from there I could work out the height it needed to be by first taking away the height of the table saw and then the casters from the total of 96. This gave me 53 centimeters as the required height for the stand. Once that was built, I would then separately build a very simple cabinet for the left hand side of the stand. This should match the total height of the right hand side once the table saw had been mounted on top. With that basic plan drawn, I could turn to the materials I actually had to build this with, and from there I could map out the cuts I needed to make to get all the parts I needed. I started with the spare sheet goods I had, and then I considered any lengths of wood that I had in my workshop. Once I had an idea of all the materials I had available, I could draw an exploded version of what the two parts would look like that would form the total unit. From there I can work out what material would be used where and the lengths I needed to cut each part. With all that figured out, it was finally time to start breaking down the material. I added a temporary workbench to catch the cut pieces, and I then started with the right hand side of the unit by cutting the plywood that the table saw will sit on. I could then cut down the chipboard that will form the base shelf of this unit. With all the sheet material cut, I could sort through the leftover wood from the dining table that I took apart in the last video, get rid of the fence on the table saw, and add the crosscut sled. I used the same process of measuring, then adding a stop block to ensure I cut all the legs of the stand to the same length. With those cut, I could move the stop block and then cut the two brace pieces that form the base of the unit. After dealing with a problem screw that was just about to wreck my blade, I finally had all the pieces cut down to begin assembly. You can see here how the pieces are fitting together nicely, and I chose to attach the legs to the brace pieces using simple nails, as this seemed to be plenty sturdy. With these connected, I could then prepare to attach the rest of the unit together as the diagram here shows. That's the structure of the stand for the table saw substantially completed. I added the bottom shelf with some more nails to finish off the structure, and I could then flip it over and add the casters to the bottom. It was finally the moment of truth to see if the measurements and cuts had been accurate, and whether it would all align nicely with the outfeed table. It appears as though I'd actually done something correctly, so I pressed on and started building the cabinet that forms the rest of the unit. This was all out of sheet material chipboard, so it was back on with the fence to break it all down. Having cut the two side panels to width first, I could then measure the length needed using this right angled measure thing, and I could then scribe that line and take it back over the table saw to cut it to its final length. I had to line the edge of the blade up with the line I just scribed on the offcut side, as my fence measure was just a little too short for this cut. I could then run it through, though I'll note that my YouTube learnings to date have taught me I should generally try to have the finished piece between the blade and the fence. I then had all my material cut and could start assembly of the cabinet. Again, out of laziness and because the novelty of having a nail gun hasn't worn off yet, I chose to do this all with nails, but glue would have helped. With the bottom attached to one side, albeit not very squarely, I used the top piece I cut earlier to set my stop block against the sled, and I could then use two pieces the same thickness as the side panels to get the correct length for a supporting piece that fits perfectly between the two sides. With any luck, this piece will now fit perfectly between the two side panels, and it ended up looking pretty good. As you can see, I attached the other side with nails again, but I mustn't have held it flush as I did this as there was a slight gap. I put a clamp between the two sides and tightened this down, and this seems to do a good job of closing the gap. With the gap closed, I could add the top, and you're going to notice a bit of a theme here, but for ease and speed, I chose to do this with the nail gun again. The intention is I'll come back and fill the nail holes later. The first few nails I drove in seemed to do absolutely nothing to hold the pieces together, so rather than trying to find a better solution, I decided it would be a good idea to just use a lot more nails. I expect this cabinet will fall apart within a month, and I'll report back if this happens. I had an audience join me in the garage to reveal the first cabinet I've ever built, which was surprisingly heavier than expected, or it's possible I'm out of shape. Anyway, it wasn't the most rigid structure that's ever been created, but it was shaped like a box and this was better than I expected. You can see here that it looks broadly correct in line with the plans, so I removed the table saw and connected the two boxes together with some large screws. This really ended up helping with the rigidity of the cabinet. I'd ordered more casters for the cabinet, but while I waited for these to arrive, I borrowed two from the table saw stand and added them to the cabinet so I could get the unit down and test whether or not I'd measured everything accurately. With the unit down, and potentially also with the hernia, I could lift the table saw into position and see how everything would fit together. It was looking pretty good at this point, but on closer inspection, the top of the table saw was sitting just below the level of the cabinet, and it needed to be the other way around. I grabbed a deck of playing cards and used those as shims to raise it up until it was just proud of the cabinet worktop. At this point, it was looking pretty good and it was very nearly complete. The only issue remaining to be solved was to continue the mitre channel grooves into the outfeed table, as currently the table saw sled is unable to run all the way through. To do this, I attached the two workbenches together with some scrap wood to ensure they remained perfectly aligned, and I could then get my palm router, insert a straight bit, and set the depth inside of the table's existing mitre channels. With the depth set, I could put a straight edge between the fence and the router within the channel. This then acts as a straight cutting guide, creating a channel that should perfectly continue the line of the existing mitre slots. I started making the first pass with the router and very quickly learned by destroying the edge of the table that I'd need to reduce the depth and do this in multiple passes. With a more sensible depth set, I could make the first pass and create the channel. And you can see here the difference between this and the first cut I made. Once this was complete, I could clear the dust, set the router to its final depth, and make another pass to finish. So to do the next channel, I repeated the whole process by moving the fence and the straight edge over until they met the router, and I could then repeat the process of doing two passes. now had two channels that were the same width as the miter slot, but I needed them to be just slightly wider to ensure they wouldn't catch the rails of the table saw sled as it passed through. Also, the edges were a little bit messy where I'd let the router stray. I should have used clamps to hold the straight edge rather than just using my hand, but that's a lesson learned for next time. To make them wider, I edged the rail guide over a few millimeters each side of the existing cut, and I ran the router through again. I've ended up producing a very unfortunately shaped end to one of the channels, but they're at least functional if not phallic. I cleaned up the edges of these channels with a chisel, and once that was done, it was time to test whether or not the sled would run smoothly into these new channels. And with that done, that's the table saw stand built. I'll be making improvements to both this and the outfeed table in later videos, including adding a router table. If you're interested in low quality productions, feel free to subscribe or ask any questions in the comments.